Good evening, everybody. Everybody who's here on a Friday night or who's watching this at a later date, thank you so much for coming on. And we're going to be talking all about speech therapy and communication. And we've been very fortunate to have Kristen Ellis with us. Kristen is an MSCCC-SLP/L, and she's not only a school-based speech therapist, but she also has a private practice with Time to Talk Therapy Services LLC. So, Kristen, thank you very much for joining us. I'm not going to go through your whole bio because it's quite lengthy, and I want people to get to know who you are, not what is written. Why did you become a speech language pathologist?
Oh, that's a great question, and everyone asks me this all the time. So when my brother was younger, he had some speech sound disorders and was receiving speech therapy, but he was also struggling quite a bit in school. So after a couple of years of continued struggling, and with the speech improving, that the schoolwork was not improving, it was actually his speech language pathologist that suggested that maybe they should look at potentially a reading disability or the gamut of reading disabilities to see if that was something that was maybe contributing to the difficulty he was having, since his speech was improving. And after testing, they realized that he actually had dyslexia. And if it wasn't for her, who knows where he would be today. But because of her, he graduated towards the top of his class and went on to be a very successful electrical engineer. And he is a lieutenant with our local fire company as well. So he's very successful. And I attribute that to her.
And you wanted to follow in those footsteps because you saw how far your brother came.
Yeah.
Before he got his professional career.
Yeah. Yeah, because he just started to, show an interest in reading again and learning. And, there weren't as many refusals to go to school or do homework. And it was just amazing how, when the right supports were in place, like how successful he was. And that was all because someone thought of something different, that maybe there was something different there. And, I get to do that all the time, and contribute to the teams that I work with. So I like doing that. And I find it interesting and fun. And
Well, and you have been recognized nationally as well as
Mhm.
a speech language therapist. So, you come with a lot of expertise, a lot of professional development hours under you as well.
Yes.
And, expanding. Bringing up about your brother, though, I mean, I think that that's a really good segue into types of speech and language disorders, because it's not just about articulation. It's not about just about pronunciation. It's also about the other disorders that can be that language disorders, and dyslexia is a language processing disorder, and
Mhm.
some of those learning disorders. There's that combination that needs speech as well, which typically isn't always done. I know that you're one of those that do,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
it's so important. But I mean, let's talk. What are the common types of speech and language disorders that you see, both school based and private therapy?
Sure.
And let's
And
talk a little bit about each one of them.
yeah, sure. And what you're talking about with the articulation, that tends to be what most people think we just do. That we just do the articulation piece of it, which is the speech part of speech and language pathologist. But actually, speech therapy in and of itself has its own subcategories. So there's the articulation piece of it, that exists, which is your speech sound disorders, your childhood apraxia of speech, but also that's where stuttering and fluency disorders fall as well. And then you have the language end of things, which is your processing of language, um, as well as your expression of language. So that has its own two subcategories as well. So I see lots of kiddos with auditory processing disorder or sensory processing disorders, that come in both school and privately. And then expressively, that expressive communication that can look like a lot of different things. I see kids that need to have difficulty with grammar, that have difficulty with formulating complex sentences, compound sentences. Maybe they're not using articles like a, and the in their sentences, um, or just even using 1, 2, 3 word phrases. So on the end of kids that are just coming into their expressive communication, I help these kids kind of just start their communication, whether that's verbally with augmentative communication, sign language. I do a little bit of everything in the beginning just to kind of see what I can get out of my kiddos, both in the school and privately. Some of the ends that I see more on a private sector are my individuals that suffer from traumatic brain injury, as well as strokes. So we work with clients with aphasia and dysphagia, which is the swallowing disorders as it relates to those neurological impairments, and also the cognitive deficits that go along with that. So we work on memory strategies and helping people remember things that typically most of us take advantage of that we can remember on a day-to-day basis. But now that they no longer have that ability, we're teaching them how to be good note takers and how to write things down or use aids that are built within their everyday technology, like their smart TVs and their tablets and their e-readers and their phones, to set alarms and things for medications and stuff like that. So we do go across the lifespan, so 0 to 100 and however far we want to go. And then depending on the age will kind of depend on what you tend to see. We see a lot of that at the younger age. It tends to be my very little ones tend to be that expressive communication. So they tend to come to me because they're not talking like their peers or like their cousins or like other family members or their siblings. And then as they get a little bit older and they're talking, we start to see the speech sound disorders. So the articulation difficulties and substituting sounds or not saying sounds right. And then we start to see fluency, which is commonly referred to as stuttering or stammering. So we tend to work through that as well. And then as we kind of get older, we start to see more of these processing type difficulties, especially if there tends to be a co-occurring learning disability or something else that tends to be present. We'll start to see more of those language difficulties with processing the language and understanding what these different words in verbal speech mean, like the prepositions like in, on, and under, and following those directions, and following conditional commands like if I do this, then do this, before you do this, after you do that. Those types of phrases tend to really get those kiddos that are having difficulty processing. And of course, as we enter school age, that's where we start to see a lot of grammar and possessives and different structures. As language gets more complex, we're expecting the kids to do a lot more. And that's where we start to see a lot more of those types of disorders present.
And and teachers, can they some of the the mass type disorders, say like with dyslexia, are there cues for parents and teachers to see, like with decoding or encoding issues?
So
pick up on.
So some of the things that you traditionally tend to see early on, or that you hear is kind of common and typical, is letter reversals, word reversals, kind of looking at words and reading them backwards. And a lot of times people will attribute that to typical development, but I always say to always keep an eye on it, especially if there's some type of family history for dyslexia or reading difficulties or learning disabilities, because it's very likely that it could have kind of come down the family tree, so to say. So I always tell families to keep an eye out for that. And then I tend to ask questions like, how are they with doing their homework at home? Do you feel like they're understanding the directions? And I also ask about behaviors that they're seeing. Because commonly when there's difficulty kind of understanding and taking apart like the homework activities, you'll hear about a lot of refusal type behaviors of not wanting to do it. A lot of temper tantrums tend to come out. But a lot of times, early on in their school career, some teachers will just attribute to that burnout throughout the day. But I always say, like, if it's sticking around, then I think it's more than just the burnout throughout the day. And I've noticed this in my own children that are school age. And, we kind of listened to the traditional of let it go, let it go, let it go. But the mom gut's always right. And I think my speech pathologist gut was right that, it was definitely something more from the beginning, that it was difficulty, processing the information, understanding the words. It's very long, complex sentences. And, I've learned now that, I trust that speech pathology gut a little bit more. Even now that my own children are going through similar situations. But behavior to me is a really big indicator as to how they respond when you present them with things, specifically like homework based activities, and especially in like English language arts, because that's where a lot of those concepts are loaded. There's a lot of grammar. There's a lot of things that they're expected to be able to do, even at a kindergarten level, that they need to be understanding and processing. So if there's any kind of difficulty there, they might scoot past a little bit, but as they move up in the grades, it becomes even more and more difficult to mask because they start to struggle more.
So if a parent does feel that there's something else going on and they decide to ask the school for an evaluation, you and I have both seen, and we've talked about this previously,
Yes.
just speech pathologists at school doing articulation parts of the evaluation. Can you tell us or tell the audience the areas that you believe should be for all students in an evaluation when it's the first evaluation they're ever getting for speech and language?
Well, there's always that typical thing that has led concern from a parent, concern from a teacher, concern from whoever is involved. And typically the biggest one tends to be articulation. But as part of my evaluations, whether they're school-based or they're private practice-based, I do what's considered a comprehensive speech and language assessment. And a lot of people do what they consider to be a comprehensive assessment. But what makes it comprehensive is that you're touching on all of those areas of language that we talked about kind of earlier on in the broadcast, where we were talking about speech sound disorders, and we were talking about language, and we were talking about cognitive ability and memory strategies. That's all kind of part of this, and looking at all of that. But additionally, and their fluency, we're looking at that. Is there stuttering present? That maybe that is the cause of what is being considered a language disorder at this point, because there is a such thing as language-based disfluency, that's what's causing the stuttering, not the other way around. But also looking at their ability to manipulate their mouth, is something that we do in oral mechanism exam. So can they stick out their tongue? Can they move it and lateralize it side to side? Can they try to touch their nose if you model that for them? And what kind of range of motion do they have with their articulators? Because that can be a big indicator of something like childhood apraxia of speech. And are they having difficulty imitating that? And when they are doing it, does it look like they're kind of reaching for something that's not there? I also look at their vocal quality. Does it sound hoarse? Does it sound dry? Does it sound high pitch? And their loudness. Do they talk really loud? Do they talk really low? And all of that can kind of fall into the element of voice disorders, which we really didn't even touch on before, but that can go across the lifespan also. And their nasality. Does it sound like they're constantly stuffed up and congested? Or do they have the other way where they're like hypernasal and it's really high pitched? And then also looking at, a lot of people forget this piece, the pragmatic social piece. And it's more, everyone just thinks it's eye contact or it's turn taking during a game. It is so much more than that. It's your ability to understand and interpret body language. It's your ability to understand and interpret humor, which we use a lot of in the English language, and sarcasm and idiomatic expressions and similes and metaphors. A lot of what we say does not mean what we say. And many kids struggle with that a lot, especially specifically in my school that I work in. It's an approved private school. Many of our children are on the autism spectrum, and they have varying degrees of that difficulty. And my first question when a student comes in is if they don't have speech, and I'm like, but should they? Because are they struggling with this? Are they struggling with that? And sometimes when kids just don't qualify for the articulation or even the receptive and expressive language piece of it, But if you would give a social language test, you would probably see a lot more difficulties with problem solving and that higher level language functioning that typically is overlooked unless you get a comprehensive speech and language assessment conducted. Um, so those are kind of all the pieces that I look at, but I also, as part of that, take a very good case history, whether it's school or private practice, including family history, as to kind of what that looks like in the family. Is there a grandfather that stutters? Is there a grandfather with a language based disfluency or cognitive difficulties or something like that? And then also what kind of injuries were present, when they were younger as well. Was there any head injury or things like that to be looking at? I also look at vision and hearing. That's another piece that tends to be left out as well. Either the question isn't asked or the walk down to the nurse just doesn't happen to find out what were the results of the screenings that are conducted in the public school as well, maybe before the child came to you at a private school, or even what's been done in the pediatrician's office as well. So that's a little bit about everything that I put in mind. They're really long. By the time all is said and done, my evaluations can range anywhere from 8 pages to 15 pages. Really kind of depends on what the concerns are and if I'm finding what I'm looking to find. Because I will keep giving assessments if I really think that there's something there until I can find it.
And that's what I always tell parents: always ask for a comprehensive evaluation,
Mhm.
and that's in all different areas, not just speech and language. But
Yeah.
in regards to speech and language, we're always asking for expressive, receptive articulation and pragmatic speech.
Yeah.
At a minimum, that has to be done. So, including but not limited to those areas,
Yeah.
because we really do want to really nut down. We look at a child as the whole child. What could be coming off as something else could
Yeah.
actually be to do with the pragmatic speech issue, that they're just not picking up on the undertones of language
Mhm.
in a social situation, and that's what's getting them into trouble with their peers.
Yeah.
So we always want to, I always want to be requesting for, the next level comprehensive evaluation, and we usually always find something. There are times when you don't,
Yeah.
that the child doesn't have any speech and language disorder from the evaluations, but we always want to try and rule everything out versus missing something and then
Yeah.
it becoming an issue. So to have put a statistic up that nearly 1 in 12,
Yeah.
7.7% of US children 3 to 17 has a disorder related to voice, speech, language, and swallowing, and that was in the past 12 months. Now this is a 2017 because that's the latest statistics that are out on the NIDC.
Mhm.
However, in the CDE, they've got the 2019-2020 figures.
Okay.
So 14% of public school students are receiving special education services under IDEA, and of that, 33% was specific learning disability. So it is a very common category. I often sometimes see, speech only IEPs, but without the functional piece to
Mhm.
relate it to it. So in that being said, how do you relate, or how do you tie in your speech therapy to Common Core? Because I feel like that's really important, and something that's often forgotten.
It's so important. And I think early on in my career, I was guilty, as many speech therapists, of not doing this as much as I probably should have been doing. But what I've learned over the course of, my career is that kids are more likely to work for you and participate in therapy if the subject material is meaningful to them. So if it's something that they're learning in the classroom and you're also targeting that, not only are they getting additional exposure to it, um, but they're also getting to practice those real life vocabulary words that they're learning with their sounds in it. And now they are able to go and practice that over and over because they are using it during this current unit of social studies or science or whatever that may be. So that kind of leads into one of the areas I tend to tie in very frequently are any kind of vocabulary goals. So synonyms, antonyms, idiomatic expressions, metaphors, similes, if they can align with their ELA curriculum, I will do that as much as I possibly can. Now, with that being said, I may need to teach the skill before I can pull all of the curriculum vocabulary. So we might use some of those early ones that you tend to hear. Like for idiomatic expressions, I always use the raining cats and dogs, but that may not be the type that they're using in third grade. So I have to then kind of go to their teachers as well. And I do a lot of teaming with my teams. And we talk a lot about where they're noticing the difficulties, and I'm asking for the materials, because you're not just going to show up one day and it's on your desk. So I think that's common too. You can write it that you're going to align to Common Core, but you can't align to Common Core if you don't see the Common Core and you don't see what they're teaching. So very frequently you're going to see a speech pathologist write a goal like that, but you don't ever see data that reflects the actual vocabulary words that they have going on in the classroom.
So how do we make sure that our speech pathology goals are actually generalizing? A lot of the times we don't see, one-to-one in a session, a child may get mastery, but then it's not generalized into the other settings such as the general ed classroom or their classroom or the community, home and community. Mm-hmm. So how do you recommend that gets tracked and monitored?
So all of my private clients, as well as my school students, they get homework at least bi-weekly from me, with things that they can do at home. So if the synonyms are related to their vocabulary, I might give them the task of trying to spy that synonym in their favorite show at home that they're watching, or that vocabulary word, and kind of gaining that exposure to it, because we know that the more exposure you have to something across environments, the more likely you are to retain it. I also communicate a lot with my parents, both privately and in the school sector, because I just find that communication is so very important, that they know what I'm doing and what I expect them to do. And I try to explain that this isn't going to happen in a room, a 10 by 10 room once a week for the school year. And then I send home specifically for school. In the summer, they all get packets that go home too, with all of the activities that they can do. Some are just, go on a nature walk and find, all of the things that fly if we're working on categorizing, or find all of the bugs. But also with vocabulary, I might have them, describe things to people as they're walking and play the I Spy games. But I also send worksheets. So I'm not like that therapist that doesn't send worksheets. Like, I definitely do send those types of things too. And you have to have the balance between the fun and kind of the more work-like activities. In the school setting, once we're kind of really getting it within my 10 by 10 room, I start to, if they're individual, I start to group them with another student. So they start to use those skills with other kids. So if we've started at 4 sessions a month individual, now we're going to be 2 individual, 2 in a small group. And my small groups in the school are 2 to 3 students. At the most, I do 4. And then I want them to do these skills with each other. And I encourage my students to be the cheerleaders for each other, and also try to figure out what they're working on. And I have those students explain what they're working on to the other peers in the group. So it's building that self-awareness about the things that they're working on and the things that they have difficulty with, which a lot of this population, that self-advocacy really isn't there unless you teach it. Like, they don't know how to say, but I need it repeated, or that word is difficult. Can you tell me what it means? Or can you help me find what it means? And then from there, I start to drop back even more, and I start to push into the classroom. And I will start to piggyback when they're doing an ELA lesson, or if they're doing a history lesson and we're going to look at the vocabulary. And I start to pull in, okay, you don't know that word. What can we do to figure it out? Let's look at that. Your teacher has asked you to do this made up country. You have to make up a country. Well, what do you know about a country from what your previous knowledge is? And we'll do things like that. And then I finally kind of back off to more of a consultative model, where my students are remaining in the classroom 100% of the time, but I might come in the back and sit in the back while they're giving a presentation. and listen to their speech fluency, or listen to their vocabulary, or listen to their grammar. And then I'll touch base with the teacher. And then I usually debrief with the student also. They don't always know that I'm there for them. Sometimes they do. They don't always. And then we'll talk about that. I also, something I really enjoy doing in the school system is going on field trips with them, because it's real life community based instruction. So not only can we go to the pumpkin patch, right, and have a good time, but we can also talk about, you know, what are some ways we can talk about, you know, those pumpkins, and how can we describe them, and like, look at this pumpkin looks different than this pumpkin. You know, and we can talk about all of those other things, but in a real life context, which is a lot more meaningful, I find, to the students. And I see more of my kids make progress since I've followed this kind of tearing down model, and back kind of backing away and letting them kind of, you know, take flight on their own. That, you know, even my parents have said, like, I don't understand how you accomplish that many goals in like one IEP term. And I was like, well, I think it's just the model that I follow. And, you know, once you find something that works, you stick with it. And so I've stuck with it now for several years, and I've applied it across different populations, and it seems to work. Now, that doesn't mean that some kids don't require a little bit more extra focus in some areas, but I definitely see the most amount of progress from kind of following that model, which I like field trips too. That's fun.
And so that actually is a good segue into AAC users,
Oh,
because they obviously need a lot more, you know, exposure and
I do.
constant modeling, and their communication partners should be modeling on the device as well, not just orally speaking to them. So
Hmm.
let's talk about AAC.
Oh,
And
you have my heartstrings now.
um,
That's my favorite. Um, so augmentative and alternative communication, which is what AAC stands for, consists of low-tech communication boards. It consists of picture icons, commonly and misinterpreted as PECs frequently, um, picture exchange and things like that. And then also sign language falls into that, as well as high-tech communication systems, which is what most people consider AAC to solely be, but that's not necessarily the case. I will say that the majority of my AAC users now are high-tech users, and about 80% of my collective caseload are AAC users. So that's lumping my school caseload together with my private caseload. And that is what I specialize in, is AAC.
but regardless of the type of AAC, whether it be a low tech communication board or a PEX board or icon, or a high tech communication device, speech output device,
Mhm.
the modeling has to, from both, from that
Yes.
from the alternate communication partner, has to be represented in that alternate communication all the time, correct?
Yes.
Like, so if I was to say,
To teach AAC, you have to speak AAC. So whatever method you are using, sign, low tech, PEX, you have to speak it too, because that's how typically developing children learn. They hear so many hours of spoken language before they even say their first word, which doesn't even happen until they're somewhere between 12 and 15 months. So the most common thing I get is that people, you hand this device to them, and now we want full blown sentences with complete, complex, accurate grammar, which it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen like that. It does not happen overnight. And and when I say you, I mean everybody working with that child needs to be doing it. Mom, dad, brothers, sisters, teachers, aides, nurses, the art teacher, the gym teacher, everybody, the doctors, everybody that's working with that student needs to show that student that they can use it too. And that's what makes these children become very fluent AAC users, is because they're seeing it modeled as frequently, if not more, than your typically developing child hears spoken language.
so I've got to read this because
I'm
I
sure
love
I'm sure
this.
you've got
You know exactly who I'm going to read off of. So Jane Carsten, she's she put this on the listserv. She's an AAC specialist.
Mm-hmm.
Says if AAC learners only see symbols modeled for communication twice weekly for 20 to 30 minutes, which is what we see a lot in speech and language services at school, it will take 84 years for them to have the same exposure to aided language as an 18-month-old has to spoken language.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really, really important because
Shocking, isn't it? Shocking.
we're not providing functional communication, and that is a human right.
Yeah.
That's not an IEP right. That's not a disability right. That is a human right.
Yeah.
And that is to be able to have your wants and needs met. And I see a lot of children being sort of almost disciplined for having behavioral issues. You know, they're not getting their token economy. They're not doing all these great things. But it's really because it comes down to that they're not able to communicate effectively for the person who's meant to be their active listener to know what they need or know what they want or know, you know, how to meet a need. And that I see all the time. So, you know, like you said, everybody needs to be doing this all the time. So you can still have verbal language going on, but you've got to model it at the same time.
Correct.
On the device to give that exposure to, because their language is their communication board or AAC device.
Mm-hmm.
And if they do, and if they use both in the school, a communication board and a high-tech output vocal device, is that do they need to match up, and why?
Oh, they absolutely need to match up. And this is another common error I see with teams that I go out, because my practice does offer implementation training for school teams and helps them kind of get all on the same page. And then I'll train them on the modeling and everything. But one of the common misconceptions, or not misconceptions, my apologies, common errors I see when I go into their classroom, because I'm like, show me your classroom. And it's a totally different symbol set for the student's visual schedule. This is the most common culprit, their visual schedule, than from their AAC device. And what I tend to see, and the complaints I'll hear, is that they're not using it, or they're only interested in the low tech board or the, and I was like, because they're not matching. They need to match, because it's really silly for me to give you, you know, your visual schedule in Spanish, but then here you're writing everything in English, because that's really kind of what it is. It's two different symbolic forms of language, and you're mixing it. And when you mix and match it and they don't align very well, it confuses students. And then what you start to see is start to see what we don't want, which is device abandonment. So you've gotten a communication device. Some speech language pathologists said that that would work for that student. They showed the ability to do it, but now it's not being implemented correctly. So now they're refusing to use it. Maybe there are increased behaviors around it. Maybe there's a decrease in usage and there's like regression that's being noted. So one of the first things I ask is what does everything else look like in the room? And then I go in and I change it all and make it all match. So my visual schedules that I use with my students all match back to their devices. Any adapted books I use that have picture support, I make sure I have BoardMaker symbols or PCS symbols. I have the symbol stick symbols. I have the lamp symbols. I have Unity symbols, and I have it all available, because you never know which AAC user you're going to have.
Well, and it is a different language. If you've got icons,
and this icon means this.
That is a picture that means one thing to the receiver.
Yeah.
For a verbal person, right, with verbal output, you know, that same icon could be verbally, I want to eat, right? So we're using I want to eat 4 words for one picture that may not rate to that person if we've got all these different things going on all across the room. So eat could be an apple on one device on the output, and then it could be a sandwich.
Yep.
You know, and I think that the salient feature piece comes into it as well, because if we're using the different types of icons we use need to be similar as well, because a lot of them, you might see as what we call the shadow, right?
Yep.
So it's a black on white
Yep.
picture, or
And
a very simple stylistic picture. But then on another device, it could be actually quite elaborate, line drawing, that is very different and can't be recognized as that's what the same thing,
yeah. And
particularly for a less cognitive, a
well,
lower cognitive ones.
absolutely. And you bring up a good point that, these kids are not speaking, and sometimes it's very difficult to get a good picture of where their receptive and expressive language skills are, because let's face it, standardized assessments were never normed on AAC users. So you don't have a good picture because more than likely there is some type of language disorder. And if you're, like you said, the symbols are different. Open is a box for symbol sticks. Open on the Boardmaker PCS symbols is someone opening a jar.
Yeah.
Open on some others is something else or another random picture. And that can be very confusing when there's already some type of underlying language disability or disorder to begin with. And then receptively, it just confuses. And then you start to get this rise in behaviors, and no one knows quite why until I'm like, but nothing matches. Your symbols don't match.
So what would you suggest for families to be able to get teams to incorporate and make sure that this explicit modeling is happening and that the classroom is modeled to that student's device? Do you recommend parents go in and have a look to make sure and to bring in those pieces, or how would you suggest they go about that?
So I think it depends on the school and the type of school, first of all, whether it's a public school, private school, a charter school, and what kind of resources they have available to them. Some school districts have resources available to them that they can just reach out, or they can make things that match. Other places are not going to be able to do that and won't have the financial ability to do that. But I always tell families that there is a wealth of availability of free resources out there that most people don't even realize exist. Starting first with, most of these companies have regional representatives that have stockpiles of low-tech boards that are sitting, and that, I ask for them all the time. They're mailing me constantly them. So, I have this stockpile of those, but they also make all the PDF files available online through their websites that you can
Mm.
actually download them. You could send them to the way you handle printing within your district, and you could get them printed. You could get them laminated.
I believe also AEM,
Yep.
Accessible Educational Materials,
Yeah.
can also provide those types of things that school districts needs.
Yeah.
They can reach out to their technology departments at the IUs.
Yep.
They can contact Patton in
Yep.
PA. There are lots of different places. They can also even reach out directly to the American Deaf Association as well, because they have a lot of stuff that they provide free regardless of the language
Yep.
disorder.
Yes, they do.
So there's lots of different options, and sometimes it just takes a parent to say, "Oh, I heard about this. Is this something that we could do?" I
Yeah.
do want to bring up about trialing of devices too, though.
Sure.
So because I do notice that even when we do a SET, which is a student environment task and tools, so we look at the student, then we look at what's already in the environment, what is the task being required, and what tools can help with that, right? So for a student with dyslexia, we might look at a C-pen or a speech to text or text to
Yep.
speech, those sorts of things. And we can also do that with AAC devices.
Yes.
When they're trialing, I think it's really important, one, that parents must request for that device to go home, but they also should have parent training on how to use the device before going home, that the staff are required to have training on that. Many times we've asked to see the logs, and devices aren't even getting used during the trial period when they said that they were going to be, because the staff didn't know how to use it or when to use it.
And it's a shame, because then during that SET meeting and that SET process, you then reconvene and you're supposed to share the data and the experience you have. And a lot of times what I've seen is that they say, well, the child's not going to be able to use it. But I don't think it's the child. I think it's the team surrounding the child. the child's not going to know what to do.
No.
And if the staff doesn't know what to do, then they can't teach the child what to do. And that's usually where the set processes start to fall apart. And then they end very quickly. And then you'll hear a lot of parents by the time people come to me, a lot of times they might say that they've had a set process done, but they didn't seem to get anywhere out of it. And a lot of it comes from that parent training piece, but also the staff training piece. Because sometimes it's even so much the staff doesn't really know what to do. Because, that whoever's running your set process, whether that's someone from the IU or that's someone from an outside agency, there's several ways that those are done now within schools, that there's just not that necessarily that piece. And it might fall on that speech therapist that's there.
And that speech therapist themselves may not have had any professional, because they may not have had any professional development in that.
And they may have never had any AAC child ever.
Yeah.
So if you don't use it, you lose it. So if you don't have someone to do it with, then you're going to lose that skill. We say that about a second language all the time. If you're not going to use Spanish, you're going to lose it. If you're not going to use sign language, you're going to lose it. And AAC is very similar. If you don't keep your skills sharp and go to continuing education, but also the technology changes constantly. So this is a field that is constantly changing. And I don't mean like every year. I mean like every couple of months it's changing. Every couple of weeks, sometimes there's updates to applications and they're adding things all the time that make these devices more accessible to more students. So maybe last year the set process didn't work because head tracking wasn't available, but now head tracking is an option. So maybe that same child that couldn't do it direct with their finger can now do it by move. They have complete control of their head. They can do it. So it's just sometimes these types of things aren't always looked at. We tend to be like, well, if they can't point and they can't do this, then they can't do it. But it's not necessarily the case.
No, sometimes it is purely because of the lack of training in those things. I mean, I've even seen it done, a speech language pathologist who had ever seen PECS and didn't know how to institute that within the child's school day.
Yeah.
And, we had to request that there was training for that speech and language pathologist to come in and do that. The other thing, too, is that I like parents to be able to trial devices with their children as well before they either get, a prescription from Medicare or what have you. So there are places, TechAL, and I'll actually put the link up at the end. Actually, I'm going to go get TechAL up now. They have a lending library.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, and it's free. You get to
you might wait depending what you're asking for, but
I absolutely love them. They're quicker than trying to get them sometimes on a trial through the districts and it's not because the districts don't want to. It's just that there is a lack of availability.
And it's technology. It's changing.
And it can cost, and it can cost a lot of money. So we don't, we're not blaming anybody for having it. It's not that, we don't have that here. We can't, no, they can still trial it, but it might take longer than a parent getting it through TechAL. So, there's always those types of trials. Technology is becoming cheaper. And when we're looking at universal design and learning, technology is playing a really big role in that. And so now, a lot of, particularly with COVID, most kids now either have a Chromebook or an iPad, which, gives them accessibility to technology that they didn't have before when we were paper and pencil. Mm-hmm. And so, we can get that speech to text, text to speech really quickly with, the extensions that are available in Chrome and on Apple. And then you've got, apps, particularly with iPads that can be put on for communication that really aren't that expensive anymore. And, just so parents know as well that any school that is participating in what they call SBAP, which is School-Based Access Program, speech and language pathologists can actually get those devices for your child. It goes and gets charged against, reimbursed against Medicare, but it's your child's device. It goes home with them. It goes home with them over summer, after school, weekends, so that there's that generalization happening. And when your child does leave school, the school has to maintain it up until they leave school. Once they leave school, it goes with them. And then the maintenance and everything is on the parent. But there's a lot of options now that we just didn't have before for communication with technology. And technology is not the be all end all, because it doesn't always, high tech technology, I'm talking about voice output
Yeah,
devices, they don't always work for every kid, because every kid
they
doesn't
don't.
want to catch.
They don't. And
Sometimes,
I've had people that I've started on picture exchange, because I'm trained in PECs as well. So I've started them there just because, for a variety of reasons. It could be a lot of reasons. They're just not quite ready for a language-based layout just yet. And after we've gotten to phase 4 of PECs, that's when I'm like, yeah, we need to retry it. Because once you get to phase 4 of PECs, it becomes a little bit more difficult to grow your language. So the availability of what you can say starts to be getting more limited than what it was initially when you introduced PECs. And lo and behold, this has happened. I think I've probably like 4 clients I've had that we've started on, a picture exchange. And then after about 6 months to a year, they were ready for a high tech system, because you have now explicitly taught that these symbols represent things, which that's usually the biggest caveat to all of this, is that they don't have that symbolic representation yet, which is causing the difficulty with communication. So sometimes you have to take a step back and explicitly teach that, and PECS is really the best way to do that.
but PECs can be limiting for long-term
Yes. For long-term
communication.
usage, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that they say like that even for some users, sign language can be limiting, because the person that they are trying to communicate with may not understand sign. So there should always be a secondary communication that is taught alongside sign. Would
Yes.
that be the same for like an outward communication device? If that device wasn't be able to be used, would that be something? Because I wouldn't see carrying around packs,
Yeah.
just in case the device breaks down,
No. So what I tend to do is my clients, we make low tech versions of their systems. We start with just like a manual board that mimics their home screen with some additional vocabulary. So their home screen may be 60 buttons on their voice output device, but their manual communication board may be 96 images at the same size, a little bit larger, just to give them, all of their WH questions and things like that. And then once they're kind of good with navigating that, I basically create custom flip books and all of these templates are available online through most of the developers' websites. You can create them. And what you're able to do is turn the low tech into the high tech by flipping pages. And that's your water friendly version. That's your sticky syrup friendly version. That's your
But
throw it in the pool.
it has to mimic
It has to match though.
their high tech
Exactly.
voice output device.
Yep.
If that's what they're using.
100%.
If it's a PEX board to take that out with you, you do the same thing. But it has to be replicated.
Yeah.
To give them their functional language, correct?
Correct.
Like,
So you can't just say, I'm going to take the board maker symbols and I'm going to make that. No, you can't do that.
Yeah.
It needs to mimic what you're using.
Yeah, because that's the biggest thing that I see, is that they don't replicate.
Yeah.
But then they're wondering why speech and language is coming along so slowly. Because that's another thing too, is that I do see a lot of very low requirement speech goals, because we know that if we set the bar low enough, a child is going to be successful, right? Because we are getting measured on our success as to how they're progressing. How do parents ensure that speech language goals are ambitious but yet attainable?
They ask me to look at them. Well, my private clients, that they all do.
Yours are all.
Yes,
I know that.
And
I'm sorry. I just want to tell the audience that we connected because we had some similar students in common, and so I have seen Kristen's work, so I can say that it's very high quality. I
Thanks.
haven't had to rip her stuff apart.
Yeah.
um,
Yes. I
so
dread meetings with Melinda when I'm the speech therapist because I'm like, did I write it? No, I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding, really though. But you know what? People like that like make you strive to write your stuff even better. So
sometimes depends on the individual, I guess,
true, true. You
because
make
we
me
have
strive to
seen
write
it
my
the
stuff
other
better.
way.
But I also look at my goals very differently, now than I did when I was fresh out of school. So, but
So
what I would recommend to families that I'm not your speech therapist, or maybe you're not seeing someone that specializes in augmentative communication, is that think about it as if your child were typically speaking child. What would you expect that child to be doing? And then that's what you should be doing with the AAC device. So if you have a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, the goal for a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old is to put 2 and 3 words together. This goes the same if your child is cognitively lower functioning and they're functioning at a 2 to 3-year-old level. Your goal would still be 2 to 3 words in a phrase or a short sentence, not one word, because that's
So
a
it's
1-year-old
more the
level.
cognitive developmental age that we'd be looking at
Yeah.
for expanding upon and making sure that we get ambition within the goals. So if we've got a 10-year-old who's at a 5-year level, like,
Mm-hmm.
cognitively at a 5-year-old age,
Yep.
then we would be looking at, 5 to 6 word
Mm-hmm.
sentences.
Yep. Correct. So you kind of want to be following that, and all of this information is readily available on ASHA. They recommend all of that, which is our national governing body that tells all of us the things we should be following as speech pathologists. And that's the American Speech Hearing Language Association. That's what they kind of the guidelines that they have set forth based on a lot of different information that they've collected over the years. Um, and when you align all of that to what a speaking child would be doing, I just take what a speaking child would be doing and maybe even that grade level. So we're talking their curriculums at a kindergarten level, but maybe they're 10. Okay, well, kindergartners should be able to categorize items and they should be able to sort items into the categories that they belong in. So now we're going to do that goal on the AAC device, which is good because most high-tech systems are language-based layouts, meaning that they are categorically organized. So when you go into the animal folder, that's how you find all the animals. When you go into, you're describing words, that's where all your prepositions are and all your, high and low and all of those words that we use to describe where things are. So I work on that, but I don't just work on that. We're going to presume competence that this child can go way further than we're predicting. And you're going to write the goal higher because you're going to presume the competence, which is a big, big push in the AAC world, that, we're going to say that they can do it because we say it for our own children that are typically developing and speaking, that they can do it. They can be a lawyer. So we're going to push them to do this. But what a lot of times I don't understand what happens, but we're going to put a computer in front of a kid and that changes how we approach it. But it doesn't. It really doesn't. We're going to approach it the same way. It's still speech and language therapy. I mean, we're just doing it a different way. You're doing a different modality. And the same thing with sign language. You wouldn't stick with one sign. You would start to combine signs. You might start to teach them short songs, the same type of thing. But when we put a computer there, we act differently as if, now we're on Mars and things are very different. And it's really not. So I
Yeah.
always say, especially parents that have other children, I always say, think about where child A was and what they were doing at this age. And don't say you don't remember, because yes, you do, because we all compare our children. We all know that when he was 5, he didn't do this. We know that, right? We're all guilty of that, myself included. Melinda, I'm sure you too. So we're all guilty of comparing our children. So if you have a speaking child and a non-speaking child, you know what that traditional timeline was and what you expected them to do when. And I say you're going to treat them the same way. You want to teach them the same skills in the same order, developmental order. Yeah.
And we have a comment from Amy Goldman. I love you, Amy. I'm so glad that
Hi,
you're
Amy.
Oh my goodness. Amy, thank you for stopping by. I'm so excited to see you on here. She says, model, expose the child to more complex language using AAC. And that, Amy, you're going to be my next one on here because I'm going to hook you,
Amy is
hook, line, and
wonderful.
sinker. She is wonderful.
So I tell
Um,
you, so the reason I feel like I know all of what I know is because Amy took a chance on me back when I was new in the field to let me work her ACEs camp, and I learned so much that's like my driving force. And I've told Amy this in person too. It's because she's helping me develop my curriculum for my AAC camp, kind of modeled after, what we were running there at Temple University. And, a lot of what I know and learned came from there. So,
yeah, she's got Talk AAC up on there. So thank you
yep.
so much. What I do want to talk about because we're almost coming up on the hour, is extended school year. And for AAC users, we're able to get AAC camps for our
Uh-huh.
students who are using AAC. We were able to do that for our little friend in common, um, without even, a hesitation, because they knew that it was needed. How can we, she said, oh, gee, no, it's all worth you. This is all you, lady. We love you.
Yes.
How do we empower parents to be able to ask for that over just the school-based ESY extended school year program that may not be AAC based and may not meet the needs of their student?
Well, I always say you have to get past that fear of no. We're always afraid of the word no, right? That's why we don't
Not,
ask for
not
things.
me.
Well, I know you're not, but that's different. That comes with your field. But parents, we feel awkward asking for something different than what's already being given. Um, and yes, I see Amy's kind of comments coming up about my camp, that it is posted on the USAC page, which is the United States Organization for AAC. So that's on there as well. But um, what I tell my families is there is no harm in presenting the information, saying this is why you think it might be a better fit. We're not saying that your program's not good. That's not what we're saying. But we're thinking that our child may get more out of this programming that is being held over the summer, that is exposure to additional AAC users, because that's the biggest lack, right? A lot of these kiddos, they're not exposed to any other AAC user. They might be the only one in their district.
Exactly.
They might be the only one in their region of the state. And that goes for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. I mean, any state. I think depending on the state you're in, you might be the only one on the whole East Coast. You might be the only one in the whole West Coast. They are becoming more readily available, like you mentioned before. And I think people are exploring it a lot more than have been in the past. But it's really important for that peer modeling. We say that all the time about typically developing kids. Well, we need to put them in Head Start, or we need to put them in preschool because they need to be around same age peers doing the same things. But it's the same thing for AAC users. They need to be around same age peers doing the same things, using the same devices, using the same language, so that they
Well, that
see.
brings up too communication partners, right? If
Yeah.
your peer is your communication partner, how many peers are actually going to know how to use your AAC device to model? They're not.
Probably none, because the biggest thing I see is if a peer goes up to touch it, the teachers are like, no, don't
Yeah,
do
don't
that.
touch it.
Don't
That's
touch
it.
it. Don't touch it. Stay away. It's not a toy. But a lot of the times, and I've had to have this conversation with my own teachers, let them do it. Let them talk to them on it, because they're going to think that's the coolest thing in the world, because their friends now can say hello in the same way that they say hello. Something so simple that we take for granted as people, that the majority of us that are probably listening to this are speaking individuals. And we take for granted the fact that that word hello means a whole lot. And we as humans really thrive on social interaction. We really do. And if we don't, what happens? We become depressed. We become loners. We don't have, all of that. Our emotions are tied to social interaction. Human beings were never meant to be, tucked away in the back of a classroom and not interact with anyone else because they have this computer. And I know, Amy was on here before. She can attest to, students that have been in that situation and how they come to these camps and they leave a totally different child because now they're like taking off. And even like as my philosophy in AAC has changed over the years and my experience has grown and my professional development has grown, I've approached things different, and I see such a difference in my AAC users. And I even encourage my clients, like we're starting to see who's like geographically close, and we're like, oh, let's have a play date. We're all going to take our devices and we're all going to go to the ball pit and we're all going to have fun and we're all going to see how and people are like, well, no, we're not going to take the device in the ball pit. That's a really bad idea. I'm like, no, it's not. It's not a bad idea. You take your phone in your back pocket and go down the slide. What's the difference? There's no difference. And no one treats it the same. I mean, and that's what I encourage, that they bring these things up when they're talking to their school teams, that I just think they're going to get more exposure out of this program. And, a lot of times school districts are going to ask, your common questions, who, what, where, right? And the money, the cost, tend to be the biggest questions. But if you're able to answer those questions and you're able to present the case, you're more often than not going to see the answer that you're hoping to get.
And if you find that you're struggling with that, you can reach out to different advocates. You can reach out to different speech language pathologists to help you with gaining access to those things for your child. There are, I know myself, I spend a lot of time just talking to parents. It's not that they have to contract with me. It's talking to them about how they can go about for their individual student, the language to use, using the fact that all programs have to be appropriate. Well, if you've got a verbal map classroom, a VB map classroom that's not heavily AAC, well, you have a good chance of getting, or if they're not a verbal map, if it's just a Gen ESY classroom, you have a better chance of getting something that's explicit for your child, particularly if you're seeing that there is either a slowdown in progress, no progress, or is totally stopped within your progress monitoring, because you're pushing in for that right to be able to, that human right to language.
It's a basic human right, and there's even a Bill of Rights related to communication. And I believe
the United Nations, rights talks about communication in a language of your choice, right? It's not about somebody else choosing it for you. It's the user's choice. So, particularly as kids get older, we give them more choice to language. Well, listen, I'm going to let everybody say goodnight to everyone. Thank you all for being here. Yeah, absolutely. Aisha even has the Communication Bill of Rights on there as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Amy, for coming on and talking. If anybody does have any questions, there's a lot of websites that we've put up for you to be able to look at and, reach out to anybody that you can to ask a question. What's the worst thing that can be said is a no. But if you don't ask a question, it's always a no. So, Kristen, stay right where you are. I'm going to end the broadcast. Amy, I'm going to track you down and you'll be coming on soon.
Yay, Amy.
Good night, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Night.